Proposition 35, Human Trafficking, Penalties, Initiative Statute. Plain language, increase human trafficking penalties, expand sex offender laws, and beef up human trafficking training for law enforcement officers. There are two types of human trafficking: sex trafficking, which is kidnapping people and forcing them to have sex, and labor trafficking, which is kidnapping people and forcing them to do work. Obviously, it is illegal to do both of these things, so don't even think about it. Human trafficking is currently punishable by state law for up to 5 years in prison, but if the victim is under 18, then it's 8 years in prison. If the victim suffered great bodily injury, an extra 6 years can be tacked on. As of this year, only 18 people are in prison for human trafficking crimes. If Prop 35 passes, it would expand the definition of human trafficking to include the creation and distribution of obscene materials depicting minors, and the duplication or selling of obscene materials, even if the offender had no contact with the minor depicted. It would create more severe criminal penalties for human trafficking: 12 years per offense for labor trafficking, 20 years per offense for sex trafficking adults, life for sex trafficking of minors that involved force or fraud, and an extra 5 or 10 years for repeat offenders. Fines of up to $1.5 million can also be imposed. Money collected from the fines will support services for victims of trafficking and law enforcement. 70% of the fines would go to public agencies and nonprofit organizations that provide direct services to victims, and the remaining 30% would go to law enforcement and prosecution agencies in the jurisdiction where the charges were filed and used for human trafficking prevention, witness protection, and rescue operations. Prop 35 includes some legal changes as well. Under Prop 35, victims could not be charged with a sex crime if it was a result of trafficking. Some defenses would also now be unavailable to defendants in trafficking trials, like ignorance of the victim's age. During trafficking trials, the victim's credibility cannot be impugned because of acts committed during trafficking. It also requires convicted traffickers to register as sex offenders. It requires sex offenders to provide the names of their internet providers and all internet accounts to local police or sheriff's departments, including email addresses, usernames, screen names, and any other personal identifiers for internet communications and activity. Any changes in these categories would require notification to law enforcement within 24 hours. Prop 35 requires at least 2 hours of human trafficking training for all police officers, highway patrolmen, and sheriffs that work in the field. Fiscal impact. Financially, it's all rough math, but it is anticipated that this law will cost a few $1 million for prosecution and incarceration expenses, and a few more million in training programs for police officers. But it is expected to bring in a few $1 million in human trafficking fines. Long story short, Proposition 35 increases the penalties for sex trafficking, expands the definition of sex trafficking, creates new laws for convicted sex offenders, and requires police officers to take human trafficking training. For the yes side on Proposition 35, they say, human trafficking is one of the fastest growing criminal enterprises in the world, and it's happening right here on California's streets and online where young girls are bought and sold. A recent study gave California an F on its laws dealing with child sex trafficking. That's why we need Proposition 35. Proposition 35 will increase prison terms for human traffickers to hold these criminals accountable. It will require convicted human traffickers to register as sex offenders to prevent future crimes. It requires all registered sex offenders to disclose their internet accounts to stop the exploitation of children online. And it increases fines on convicted human traffickers and uses these funds to pay for victim services so survivors can repair their lives. Sex traffickers prey on the most vulnerable in our society. The average age when a girl is first trafficked is 12 to 14. The traffickers grow rich and throw their victims away. Prop 35 will hold these criminals accountable and protect children from sexual exploitation. And the opponents of Prop 35 say you should vote no because this measure is allegedly aimed at human trafficking but actually threatens many innocent people. If Proposition 35 passes, anyone receiving financial support from normal consensual prostitution amongst adults, including a sex worker's children, parent, spouse, domestic partner, roommate, landlord, or other, could be prosecuted as a human trafficker, and if convicted, forced to register as a sex offender for life. Maxine Dugan, one of the Prop 35 opponents, remarks, "My son, who served our country in the U.S. military and now attends college, could be labeled a human trafficker and have to register as a sex offender if I support him with money that I earn providing erotic services." Rather than working with sex worker communities to stop real human traffickers, the far-left anti-sex feminists and the far-right religious conservatives who back Prop 35 hope voters who hear trafficking will be deceived into supporting their futile crusade against the world's oldest profession by further criminalizing people connected with consensual adult prostitution. It will allow the government to criminalize adults who were arrested for prostitution under the guise of rescuing children. Criminalizing prostitutes is the condition that allows exploitation. They say Prop 35 would create a new unfunded liability for our state, just when California's government is in fiscal crisis and numerous cities have already filed bankruptcy. A wealthy executive supplied over 90% of Prop 35's campaign donations, but his money won't be there to fund enforcement. The idea that traffickers will foot the bill for new criminal justice expenses is wishful thinking. Forfeiture hasn't paid for the war on drugs, and it will never adequately fund a war on prostitution either. If this passes, California will be writing another blank check to the proponents of Prop 35. If passed, the state will likely be required to defend this statute in courts, as it will likely face legal challenges due to several questionable and possibly unconstitutional provisions, including a vague definition of human trafficking and intent to distribute obscene matter. This short-sighted ballot measure also relies on a broad definition of pimping. This could cause parents, children, roommates, domestic partners, and landlords of prostitutes to be labeled as sex offenders. This misguided proposition uses factless fearmongering to goad voters into gambling on future fines and fees that risk redirecting scarce state resources away from existing social service intervention programs. Now this is where I get to be so unpopular. It's one of those laws where no one can speak out against it or else they'll be accused of supporting human trafficking. So-and-so voted no on preventing human trafficking? Oh my gosh! And to make it worse, the No on Prop 35 campaign is a couple of erotic service providers and an individual who calls herself Star Child. And I'm certainly not trying to get lumped into that crowd. But I'm just not a fan of many of the finer points of Prop 35. Of course, I despise human trafficking. Of course, I think people should be duly punished for human trafficking. But this law, like so many others, has some very weird provisions. First, a person could be charged with human trafficking for photocopying obscene materials, even if they've never even come in contact with individuals in the pictures or video or whatever. That is not human trafficking. As grotesque and perverted as it is to possess, duplicate, or distribute obscene materials, I think that should be its own crime. Human trafficking is kidnapping, not photocopying. The reason why I so strongly oppose inaccurate labeling is because it destroys the power of the term human trafficking. It's just like the sex offender label. They put so much stupid junk in it, the power of the label has been diminished. The label sex offender should be for vile, despicable sex offenders. But now nobody knows if someone is a real sex offender or a, quote, sex offender. Are we talking about a rapist or a homeless guy who got caught urinating in an alley and is now a sex offender? Are we talking about a pimp or a 19-year-old having an inappropriate relationship with a 17-year-old? People in their heart of hearts see a difference between someone raping someone in an alley and someone peeing on a dumpster in an alley. The latter should be charged with public urination, not a sex crime. It'd be just like if someone made a new law that being mean to children was now considered emotional murder, and then saying that anyone who was mean to or yelled at a child would now be charged with murder because he murdered little Jimmy's emotions. Then nobody would know if a person was really a murderer or just a, quote, murderer. To me, it's the same thing when you charge someone with human trafficking who's never even seen the person he or she is accused of trafficking. Likewise, a person caught with obscene media should be charged with possession or distribution of obscene media, not trafficking. Don't weaken such a powerful label. Second, this Prop 35 will raise criminal justice costs. The supporters of Prop 35 say they will come up with the new money by finding convicted traffickers, but that's just conjecture. It's assuming that they will arrest enough traffickers and that these traffickers will have enough assets to offset permanent new law enforcement expenses. There are 18 people in prison for human trafficking. Are we really going to bank on that as a reliable revenue stream? Then this law imposes really lengthy sentences. I think it's a little odd that you can get out for murder sooner than human trafficking under Prop 35, but I can live with that. Obviously, human traffickers are some of the most abhorrent people on earth, so fine, stay in prison for 20 years and think about what you did. Whatever. All of the new trial amendments are fine, requiring sex offenders to report online information. I think that should be in a different bill, but fine, I can live with that being in this bill. I don't agree with any of the arguments from either the Yes on Prop 35 campaign or the No on Prop 35 campaign. The yes people just try to tug at your heart with emotional issues and sad stories to get you to pass the bill regardless of what's in it, and the no people seem wholly concerned with upholding the rights of prostitutes and their cohorts. Again, I'm not a fan of prostitution and I don't care to see it legalized, but I do not like the fact that they added all this weird stuff in there so that pornographers become human traffickers and the associates of prostitutes become human traffickers and everybody's a trafficker. I think this law should just be a human trafficking bill and address the issue cleanly and accurately. I think everything gets murky when you try to make a point of twisting and inflating everything into human trafficking so that everybody knows you're serious. And by the way, I'm totally fine with voting for a proposition that deals harshly with human trafficking, and I'm totally fine with laws that deal harshly with the creation, duplication, and distribution of obscene materials. I just think that these bills need to be labeled appropriately, they need to not raise costs or taxes, and they need to not include random other things that people thought they should just throw in. I imagine this bill will pass anyway because people will read the title and say, "Stop human trafficking? That sounds great." But I'm still voting no simply because of the way the bill is written. Also understand that even voting against this, there's still solid enforcement via current California law, and even more so from federal human trafficking laws. So I'm going to vote this one down for now. Good idea, shaky implementation.